to the 2020 Meet the Press Film Festival at AFI Fest. We are so glad to have you here, especially now when we are less than a month from the election. And as you can tell from the films you just saw, there's a lot more on the ballot than just, of course, the two candidates that everybody's talking about. I want to bring in some of the people that you've seen and some of the people behind the scenes of the films that you've just watched. Joining us today, we have Moises Saman, who is the director of When the News Hits Home, the year inside the Capitol Gazette. We're also joined by Paul Moakley, who's a producer on that film. From the other film, Sustained Outrage, we have Gabriela Cavanagh, who made that amazing piece of art that you just saw, along with Eric Eyre, of course, the journalist who is one of the people featured in that film. Everybody, we're so happy to have you in this sort of strange virtual version of our film fest this year, but I'm excited for this panel. I have to tell you guys, yeah, of course. Both of these films hit very close to home for me. I came up in local news. I'm a former local news journalist, and I am a diehard believer in the importance of local news in the communities that they serve. And I think that shining a light on that is one of the best and most important things that other journalists can do. So I'm thrilled to be with you. And one of the common threads in both of these stories, and Gabriela and Moises, I'd like to start with you on this, is the idea that in these films, the journalists are the stories, right? The news is the news, as the title of this panel describes. And in fact, in your film, Moises, that's one of the things that they talked about, was the idea that they have to cover themselves as part of the news. So I'd like you guys to start off to talk a little bit about how you got these journalists to open up about themselves, because there is, I think, sometimes a level of, I don't know if it's humility or discomfort with journalists revealing sort of their own stories and putting that out there. Moises, let me start with you there.
Sure. No, absolutely. It was a long process. It was very difficult to get them to speak about themselves because, as you say, you know, these are professionals that their job is to tell other people's stories, and they do it so well too. However, you know, they did go through a extremely tragic event during that shooting, and you know, I first met them almost about 6 months before we started shooting the film. I met them through a Time magazine shoot that I was part of when they were awarded the Person of the Year issue, 2018. And you know, it was you know, Paul was very much involved in making that happen, in making those sort of connections, and you know, it was you know, quite a difficult process, but in the end, you know, they opened up eventually, and we were thrilled to be able to tell that very intimate part of their life, their story.
And it was intimate. Gabriela, how about you when it came to traveling out to West Virginia and being able to, you know, your piece opens with something that I am familiar with as again, former local news reporter of, hey, people don't tell our stories the right way, right? So how did you get them to trust you that you would, in fact, tell their story in the right way?
Sure. For us, it sounds like it was quite a different process. We actually did not have much time to meet the journalists and the folks at the paper before I started filming, due to the nature of the way the project developed. So the very first time I met Eric and the characters you see in the film was actually during the bankruptcy. I had been working on the producing side of the project and not traveling to West Virginia, just due to the nature of things. So there was a huge point of tension, I would say, during the filming, that, you know, these reporters were there and their ethos is working in their communities and staying there. And there I was, this parachuter journalist type, asking them all these intimate questions. So it was very difficult. And there were a lot of folks who did not feel comfortable speaking about the bankruptcy as it unfolded, especially because it could have resulted in the loss of their jobs. But Eric felt very comfortable speaking his mind and sharing this process, which was immensely helpful. I think it's due to his general attitude as a journalist to speak his mind. And is one of the reasons we decided to follow the character Leslie, who was actually covering the bankruptcy proceedings, and how that perspective from a young journalist through that lens.
Eric, natural tee up to you here. What was it like for you when the producers, when Gabriela and the filmmakers came and said, hey, we want to talk to you about this process here? What was it like to be able to have them follow you around, to talk to them, to share some incredible moments, the winning, of course, of the Pulitzer Prize, et cetera?
Yeah, to be honest, actually, I didn't trust Gabby when I first met her. It took some time when I saw the film. She just did a wonderful job. They had previous directors that came in. We had one in particular that the joke around the newsroom was she would text us saying, "When does this get exciting?" Because I don't know, it's not like Spotlight. You know, people see this, think this idea that, you know, we're answering the phone Spotlight and we're running out, dashing, you know, and, you know, drinking whiskey and coffee and all that stuff. It's just not like what it is in the movies. It's kind of dull. You know, they would ask us like, "Well, what are you doing now?" And I'd say, you know, I'm looking through a, you know, 260-page lawsuit or something like that. And they're like, "Well, when, you know, that's not really that exciting." And I said, "Well, you know, if we have a flood or a coal mine disaster, then it gets exciting. But, you know, for the most part, it's just kind of daily, you know, going through documents, making phone calls." But in the end, I'm so grateful that Gabby got involved, and Luke, the director. They really brought the whole story home and captured, I think, a real good picture of, you know, the struggles that we face out in the local news business. I'm actually working with a nonprofit now, Mountain State Spotlight. So we've gone through, since the film's come out, there's been a lot of layoffs and everything. So yeah, it's hard to build trust, and people were real nervous about. I mean, I had to couch my words a lot too, because, you know, you just, you know, we would be told that, you know, well, if you don't want this on there, it's not, you know, in the film, let us know. But, you know, we didn't know. People coming in from New York, just like you said, there's this sort of lack of trust. But Gabby, I trust her completely now. But at the beginning, I didn't know. I mean, you know.
Right. No, I get it, right? And especially with it's your community, it's your home that you've lived in, right? And it's somebody else coming in on that. And I think the issue of trust is really interesting. And Paul, Moises said something about this, and I want to ask you the idea of getting people to open up, right? So for Gabby, it was Eric and his team. For you, it was the team at the Annapolis newsroom, right? And they were talking about some incredibly personal, some incredibly serious struggles that they've gone through. You had one, of course, of the staffers talk about having thoughts of having harmed himself potentially. You have the editor who talked about, hey, you know, I wrote down but never published that I maybe wanted to trade places with the victims because he had so much guilt. I think that even now in society, there is such a stigma talking generally about mental health, and that's starting to change, but especially I think in our industry, it's really a difficult thing to get into. So how, Paul, do you think that this film was able to have these journalists open up in such a very deeply personal way?
Yeah, I think it was really helpful to set some parameters right from the start of the request to do this. Once we did the Person of the Year story, which they had no idea they were being chosen as one of the People of the Year that year. So it was kind of a real surprise to them. And I think that helped build a lot of goodwill because they loved the way the story was presented. But Moises just felt like he was just scratched the surface at that point and really wanted to go deeper into the stories of many of the people that he got to travel around the world and meet. And we decided to start with the Capital Gazette. And I think one of the first things that we set up was this idea of like not re-traumatizing them and not making them recall the most horrible events of what happened. Like one of the ideas that we really thought about a lot was if they already recounted this somewhere else, we wouldn't make them go back and do it again. We would try to use that archival and just build from there. But it was a slow process of really just getting them to trust us. And a lot of them just opened up. They're journalists, and I think they really understood the process of what we were trying to get across. But it was fortunate that we actually did have a lot of time with them one-on-one, and it really let them open up over the course of that.
And in the idea of not re-traumatizing people, am I correct? The shooter's name was never mentioned once in the film, spoken aloud, right? Was that an intentional choice?
Right.
Do you want to speak to that, Moises?
Yeah, I mean that sort of, you know, goes to what Paul was saying in terms of the parameters that that we said. And you know, I mean, at one point there was a, you know, we filmed a discussion that they had amongst themselves when they were preparing the year anniversary issue. You know, and there were concerns about, you know, every time his name would pop up on Twitter, that, you know, people would have, you know, sort of quite severe reactions, and they would be re-traumatized. And so in that sense, it did come up in the film. However, we decided that, you know, that wasn't really necessary. We wanted to really focus on their struggle and on their sort of, you know, journey of recovery, rather than make them sort of, you know, sort of run us through the events, which, you know, by that point they were known by everybody.
And that really comes through. I'm wondering, Moises, there was a powerful scene where one of the reporters goes back to the Naval Academy a year later, a year after the shooting, and they honor the victims of the shooting. Did you know that that was going to happen? Did she know? It looked like it packed a pretty powerful and emotional punch there.
Yeah, no, we had no idea. But, you know, Annapolis, in a way, it's a small town, and that's the paper of record there. And you know, you know, it's a small community, and there were several of the reporters that had very close ties with the Academy going, you know, for many years. And one of the victims, you know, I think she was also from a family of sailors, and so there was a lot of connections there, but no, we had no idea that that was the case.
There was an editorial choice, Gabby, that you made in your film. And I thought it was interesting, or maybe it wasn't a choice, maybe it's just how I understood it, but it was about the publisher. And oftentimes, listen, as Eric knows, as all of us know, there have been story after story of local newspapers, local news outlets going under, getting gobbled up by big corporations. And oftentimes it's the publisher who's the villain. But there were a couple of moments where you talked to the family publisher who was, you know, kind of going under, and she talked about the guilt that she felt, how she felt like her father would never have let this happen. And there was a choice, it seemed, to not villainize the publisher, right? And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about that and your experience with her.
Sure. I mean, my experience with Susan and the Chilton family, I mean, it was one of the huge draws of this story initially, and it was always this idea of a family-run newspaper that drew us in. So from the beginning, they were never sort of seen as the villains, because we got to know them in sort of the pre-bankruptcy process, and how the fact that they were family-owned and not a conglomerate was a huge draw for the reporters there. So Susan always was seen that way in my eyes, and I didn't really expect her to open up about the guilt she felt about the bankruptcy, but I thought it was interesting to share that perspective, that it wasn't just this newspaper that she had been working at for a few years, it was her family legacy. And her father, Ned Chilton, is a huge reason why a lot of reporters went there. So it felt very organic to the whole story.
And Eric, when you talk about the Chilton family, when you talk about the paper and obviously sustained outrage being kind of the ethos of things, there's a great scene that Gabby opens the film with, where Amerisource Bergen, I believe the company is, says to you and another one of your colleagues, "We've been reading a lot of your work. We thought you'd bring you in. We thought we'd have you in for a bit of a conversation." And to me, that spoke to the impact that local news reporters can have, right? With these big corporations, it's because of the work that you're doing and the writing that you're doing consistently that ultimately kind of has to grab their attention. And I'm wondering if you can talk to that.
Yeah, I mean, that was a stressful time. They brought in the lawyers from New York and from Philadelphia and DC. I think there was just the two of us, me and Rob Byers, the then executive editor, and then there was a room of probably 14 people. And to be honest, they were just kind of trying to bullshit us, trying to say that all these shipments, that there's no possible way they could have tracked, you know, these massive numbers of pills that went and flowed from that they sold in southern West Virginia. But yeah, I had never even been in that law office before. But that particular firm that was representing them has a history. They represented the coal companies. They're usually on the wrong side of history, to be honest. Yeah, it was I kind of regret the smirk that I have on my face in the one scene where there's part of the scene in the end. Like, you know, like I didn't believe what they were saying. Well, I didn't believe what they were saying. And it's since come out that they that same company, only, I guess it was back in May, and it kind of got drowned out by all the COVID stuff, understandably. But they had to release a document that showed that it was lyrics to the Beverly Hillbillies, but set in West Virginia, like the Hillbillies are doing OxyContin, and it was a song that was circulated among the top executives of AmerisourceBergen. So after we read that, I was kind of disgusted and thought to myself, you know, all this time, not only were they lying to us, but they were making fun of us too, which is, you know, really hard. And, you know, to see these emails going back saying, you know, isn't this a funny thing, ha ha ha, and smiley face. And it was a whole song that somebody had written that, you know, it was called Beverly Hillbillies. So they were making fun of us. But yeah, that was a stressful situation. I think I hadn't slept much the night before either.
Yeah.
And it was you know, just a lot of corporate people. I think the problem with it is there was one guy that talked the entire time, and then after he talked, and we couldn't hardly get a word in edgewise. They all had their suitcases, and then he jumped on the corporate jet back to New York and Philadelphia.
How do you, as somebody who's been a member of this community for so long, and you talk about that, and your colleagues talk about being part of a paper that covers their home, and I was struck by, you know, the idea that I think it was you, somebody said, tells younger journalists, come and stay for more than a year, stay for a couple of years, because that's how long it kind of takes for you to get a feel for a place. There is, I think, an instinct in some groups to go on and go, hey, national paper, let me move up the ladder, let me move to a bigger organization. How do you, as somebody who's stayed there and who's covered his own community for so long, do you think about separating sort of the anger that you might feel personally about your community from the way that you cover it? Or
Yeah,
you're just a human being, and that's how you do your job.
Yeah, I think I can do that. It's not always easy. And you're right about people staying. I mean, we've had so many reporters when I was at the Gazette Mail that would just stay for 8 months or 10 months. And I just begged and pleaded, you know, just to stay for a year or 2 years. But we're so used to, you know, larger media organizations sort of cherry picking our best work and then getting credit. And, you know, in this case with this stories about what I was most proud of, and it wasn't just me, but the, you know, exposing the pill shipments, but it was sort of, you know, it was us doing it. It was a lawyer. It was Debbie Priest, a woman. She's in one of the scenes holding up a list of friends of hers who had died of overdoses. She was sort of the Erin Brockovich character in my book. And, you know, what I've said is it was kind of this idea, it takes a village. I know that's overused, but it really did. It took a number of different people. It took lawyers volunteering to help us. It took, you know, but it was something that we did. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, it wasn't like somebody came in to save us from, you know, a big company. It was all done locally by, you know, local people in Appalachia.
And you talk about the importance of local communities, and Moises, that's something that comes through in your film as well. And I think that you and Paul sort of touched on that when you mentioned how at the Naval Academy, I know Annapolis well, I don't live too far from there here in DC. And the community came together obviously after the shooting, but now, you know, the story tracks the recovery here of this newsroom. And you talk about how the normalization of shootings like that, and comes up in the film, should not happen, and you know, how it shouldn't be an A2 or A7 page A7 story, right? It should be above the fold every time it happens. Moises, can you reflect a little bit on that idea and how you saw the journalists that you interviewed and that you talked to reflecting on that?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I mean, not many of us go through these type of tragedies, you know, and when this happens in such a tight-knit group of people that, you know, they're used to sort of, you know, really telling other people's stories, you know, for them it was an incredibly powerful sort of experience that, you know, they had to reflect on, you know. However, I mean, the community, you know, yes, at the beginning, it really there was an outpour of support, of love and compassion. But, you know, as they started reporting on issues of gun violence and you know, because they really took on these issues sort of with a vengeance in a way, you know, they really thought that this was their chance to really tell this story, that it's such an American story as well, you know. And so for them, it was, you know, it was a complicated relationship with the community over time as the months went on, because, you know, not many people think the same way about how to sort of deal with this problem in this country, you know?
Yeah, and Paul, maybe you can speak to sort of where we are now, and if you've had any follow-up since you stopped sort of production of the film. Any response from the journalists there? Have you had a chance to go back since you've sort of put the film to bed? I always like to kind of ask, you know, present day, where are they now, kind of?
Yeah, we've, you know, I feel like one of the things I do with a lot of the stories that I report on is keep in close contact with the subjects for a long time. And I feel like I'm always on social media chatting back and forth with Rachel and Celine. Celine Sanfelice, the reporter who you spoke about, she actually was kind of our entryway into the story. She was one of the most outspoken about the shooting and what they were experiencing. And, you know, she really, I think, gave us the idea for the story that this has like this enormous ripple effect into the community, into their families. It's not just them surviving the shooting that day, it's like their families that are also in therapy and their friends who are having to deal with them and sort of like help them get through and survive this. But when it comes to like the bigger operation of like community journalism, it's, you know, it's, well, like in terms of like, to go back like to being in touch with them, I think they, like most journalists, they were just really shy about it. At first, I think Rick was the first person we actually showed the film to. And he kind of just went quiet and wasn't, he said, I kind of respect what you guys have done. And then hung up and then called me back about 30 minutes later. And he was like, I just want you to know I'm happy with it. I feel like you guys were really, really straight about everything that you said you would do. And that made me feel good. And from Rick, that is a big compliment, because he really tries to stay behind the wall of just being an objective journalist, working in just a really clear traditional way. But, you know, they, as an organization, since this moment, they've endured a lot of cutbacks. A lot of the journalists who were responsible for putting the paper out that day, the day after the shooting, those people have actually been laid off from their jobs since. Josh McCarrow, the person who speaks about, you know, just really the trauma and the suicidal thoughts, he's been laid off from the paper with Pat. And so I think it's been another layer of things that's been really hard for the staff. And then recently it was just announced that their office is never going to open again, that they're all going to work remotely as part of cutbacks that are happening to papers across the country. And I think every media organization, we're all experiencing this. Yeah.
Gabby, last question to you, and same question here. Do you think that the Gazette Mail journalists still feel like they dodged a bullet after the bankruptcy, and what has been your contact with them?
Sure. I think it's been a very complicated aftermath since the bankruptcy at the Gazette. I'm sure Eric can speak a little more to it, but from what I hear from him, they do feel like they dodged a bullet, like they could have been worse. But things with HD Media have also not been swell. There have been a lot of cutbacks as well, a lot of layoffs, a lot of folks who've left. In fact, all of the main characters in our film are no longer there. Right. So it feels like a very different place. I think the fact that Eric and his colleague Ken Ward, who were sort of the top two journalists at the paper, have left and formed their own nonprofit says a lot about the state of the Gazette Mail and sort of also the state of news going forward in the region.
Yeah. I just can't tell you how thrilled I am to be able to talk to all of you after watching those powerful films about the state of local news, the state of local journalism. It is so important. And I just hope that everybody watching subscribe to your local paper. That's one of the most important things that you can do. Paul and Moises and Gabriela and Eric, I'm so glad for you to have made the time to join us today, and for everybody watching, thank you. You can see more films, by the way, from the Meet the Press Film Festival at AFI Fest by going to fest.afi.com. Again, thrilled to have you here and have a great rest of your evening.